Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissonance. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Neil Townsend. Neil is senior market analyst at FarmLink Marketing Solutions. Neil has been on this podcast a couple of times. I am lucky enough to call Neil a friend, and as always, I find Neil's insights and sense of humor exceptional. One of the reasons I wanted to have Neil on is because we are both appearing at GrainFox's Before You Grow event, preceding and marketing insights from the experts. That will be at 10 a.m. Central Time on April 12th. It'll be over Zoom. There is a link to sign up in the description of this podcast if that's something that might interest you, whether you are directly involved with agriculture or just interested in getting a more on-the-ground perspective, or just want to hear me and Neil and Sean and some others talk about agriculture. Those are all good reasons to go check that out. Other than that, I thought this was a particularly good episode. We recorded on March 17th. This will come out a week later. Some of this stuff, I imagine we'll get more clarity on the Black Sea Grain Initiative and some other things that we talked about in this podcast. But if you're wondering why things may sound a little out of date, it's because we recorded this on March 17th. But I still think most of it holds up. So without further ado, from me, cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. What a world we live in. Neil, it's the podcast listeners don't know, but we've been chatting for the last 30 minutes. I guess I should have had the mics on because we were having a good time. How's it going, man?
It's going well. It's always a interesting time. Let's say that. Like, you wake up in the morning, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but you reach for your phone and you think, man, what could have happened in the time that I was sleeping? And it's always an adventure.
It is always an adventure. Before we get started on the adventure, you and I are here because GrainFox is having their preceding event. That's why I'm looking off to the side here to get the details right, because I tried to record a video about this earlier this week and I got the date wrong. So I'm going to try to fix that this time. The annual GrainFox preceding event is April the 12th at 10 a.m. Central Time. So there'll be details about that in the description for this podcast if you're interested in seeing and hearing me and Neil and Sean Haney and Ranoff get together and talk about the world and things like that. There's plenty more of this to come. So if that's of interest to you, check out the podcast description. And without any more advertising, let's get into it. Neil, I don't even really know where to start. There's so much going on in the world, but I think a useful place maybe to begin is that I think most people are thinking about 22, 23. And as you said to me before we got on the podcast, it's really about what's happening in 23, 24. Those are the types of decisions that farmers have to make right now. What do you think are the biggest variables that farmers are dealing with 23, 24? I have to tell you, from my perspective, for the llast couple of years, the Russia-Ukraine war aside, I sort of felt like I knew where things were going. Food prices were going up. It was like La Nina was sort of locked in, and it seemed obvious that it was going to be at least a double. And then we got the triple dip La Nina. Like, a lot of these things were sort of locked in. And now it's even more uncertainty. Is it La Nina? Is it El Nino? Are prices going to go up? Are prices going to come back down because they've been too high? Where does, biofuels and things like that work in? So that's me rambling, and I'll throw it over to you. What do you think are the really big picture things that farmers are thinking about as they make decisions about 23, 24, not looking backwards at what happened in the previous year?
Yeah, from an analytical perspective, like myself and the people that I work with, you mentioned one of them, Randall Glanville, we had long thought that, 23, 24 and the tail end of 22, 23 would be what we would call reversion to mean. Like, we thought that we saw the weakness coming and that there was going to be some weakness. Now, part of that was looking at South America and saying that, they're going to have a record crop. That, they still have a big crop, but it's not as big as it was going to be because of what happened in Argentina. Yep. Part of that was looking at Australia and saying, they're going to have a, big crop. Part of that was saying that, we're going to have a longer tail from the Black Sea because, Russia had this big crop. And, Australia and Russia, those two things did materialize, but, and we have had some reversion to mean. But at the same time, we've had incredible macroeconomic circumstances. I wouldn't say it's unprecedented because, this stuff has happened before. It's going to happen again. It just seems to be happening in sort of rapid fire fashion. And I think that going into 23, 24, farmers are a little bit confused because they are prisoners to the nearby prices, and they've gotten accustomed to sort of, very high prices. They had a lot of concerns about input costs. Some of the input costs have come down. Now, the unfortunate few farmers or some farmers have already bought at higher prices. That's disappointing, but the availability of some key fertilizers and chemicals are going to be much cheaper than they maybe thought. So there's, more opportunity now to, service the crop. And what we say is like, yield your way to freedom. And I would say that's sort of what looks like, is the intention right now for farmers. They're going to plant every available acre. And yes, they're worried about prices, but they're going to put more of their efforts, as they always do, into just trying to do their own form of risk management by yielding as high as they can yield, possibly. So, we might see a little bit more fertilizer application, a little bit more, nobody spends money just to do it. They spend it in a tactical sense because they think if I apply this, I'm going to, get a bigger yield. And then in the back of their mind, I think they're still nervous about, macroeconomic circumstances. I don't think the interest rates have started to pinch farmers yet. That will happen more when, they have to do some refinancing or, roll over their mortgages or do all this kind of stuff. It's going to have an impact probably on, the pace at which land values increase.
Mm-hmm.
And, for some of their funding. But again, like in the US and Canada and around the world, Canadians can get interest-free loans from the government, up to, I think it's $250,000. Like, in the US, you farm for the government. I mean, there's a lot of things that hide maybe what would be happening to, say, a small business, like in the city or something like that. And maybe rightfully so. I'm not going to debate or argue that, but I think macroeconomics very important. I think they're confused on the geopolitics. I think they thought there'd be a longer lasting war premium. They didn't really see that. So now they're wondering, does it matter? And my answer is it might matter in 23, 24, because that's might be where we see the war premium, because I think there's going to be, more of an impact on the production cycle in Ukraine and for this coming year.
Yeah, there's a lot to break apart there. Is it true? Before I want to, of course, hack into the geopolitics there and the macro econ there, but before I turn to that, just land values in the United States, whether it's cropland or pasture land or anything else, have just, something like up 20, 30% year over year now for a couple of years because there's a lot of interest in it. Is that the same in Canada? Has there been this rush for funds and sort of high net worth guys looking out and trying to buy up farmland because they see that as something as a hedge against inflation? Are farmers in Canada sitting on suddenly much more wealth than they were accustomed to before and trying to figure out what to do with that? Or is that a uniquely American experience?
No, land values have gone up considerably in Canada, and there's been a lot of farm amalgamation as well. Like people have been buying land and making their farms bigger. And I think there's, at the back of their head, they're all sort of, economies of scale is considered the way to do it. And just like, it's like Wall Street too, where Shia LaBeouf asks the one guy, like, what's your number? And he says more. And I think that's sort of the overriding attitude of farmers here that, if you have more, and when I say more, I mean more land, more storage bins, more production, that is your greatest chance of success. I mean, there's not that much sort of like, oh, I'm going to be a smaller producer and bespoke it for a higher value market. I think experience has shown that those so-called like, hey, produce less, but produce it better, those markets aren't very stable. So, the attitude and standard practice in Western Canada is, the farmers that continue to farm are like, we're going to try and, either produce more from the land we have or get more land and produce more that way.
That's a really interesting point. And I wonder, that probably is not going to switch in 23, 24, but I wonder if some of the things that are happening in geopolitics are going to change that. In the same way that, in the United States, it's becoming, and it's just at the beginning, but it's becoming attractive. If you can say this was made in the United States, you're going to attract more interest from consumers, from the government, who are willing to pay a higher price because they see that, okay, the making of this product is somehow tied to the strength of the nation or the best interest of the nation and things like that. And as we get into a more geopolitically competitive environment, I wonder if that will also trickle down into food. It historically, you're right, has not. We've always told our farmers we want more food, we want cheaper prices, and it hasn't really worked. But I don't know. It's probably wishful thinking, but maybe something about the regionalization and the move away from globalization and some of these geopolitical issues that we're going to talk about, maybe it will open up a space for that is more predictable and more reliable, and consumers will be willing to pay more for something if you can slap a label on it and say, this is 100% grown in Canada with inputs from North America. No Uyghurs were harmed in the production of this of this corn. I don't know. Is that crazy, or can you imagine a future where that is possible?
Yeah, the interesting thing about like food, and it's like we kind of exist in two states with food in general, right? One is that farmers end up being successful, and more times than not, say over the last 100 years, you would characterize sort of like the advanced countries of the world have more food than they need, right?
Yep.
And food as a proportion of your expenditure of income has been steadily going down in those countries. And farmers forget that like it wasn't that long ago that we had like sub $3 corn or sub $4 corn, and that general condition can last for a while. And I remember being out, and when you have like food costs, like the commodity costs are relatively low, that's when, or that's when farm income becomes more of an issue, right? Because, farmers have been good at their job for a few years. The weather's cooperated, we have building stocks. And that's where you get more interest in sort of like this bespoke, that's where like, farm to fork or, the 100-mile diet and these kinds of things. What you see happen though is when commodity prices go up by 25, 30, 40, 50, 100%, all of a sudden, all of those sort of like hipster buzzwords become a lot less important, like farm to fork or whatever. And so the problem with that is like, you'll establish relationships to make it meaningfully profitable to say, make a product like carve off 100 acres of your 5,000 acre farm to do something that has this is going to go direct to this restaurant or this. And then what happens is that, things get tighter, that restaurant that's no longer, long-term, it never works because you have these commodity cycles. So I used to be a much bigger proponent of that, of saying that, do something that seems to be outside of the realm of the commodity cycle. But the problem is that, as soon as the commodities become, a greater proportion of a restaurant or a grocery store cost for a person, they start to switch their habits quite quickly away from the luxury items. And I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the top 10%. I'm talking about the next 40% who covet being like an influencer or covet being like, they're doing it because it's healthy for their kids or healthy for them or whatever. It's just like, as soon as the price of everything goes up, there are things that they were treating themselves to because it, felt good for the environment or it felt good for this. That goes by the wayside. Everybody cares about the environment when corn is at $3. Very few people care about the environment when corn's at $9 or $8.
Yeah. This podcast will go in about a week or two. So I was going to say earlier this week, I was talking to our friend Dan Bassey, but it's going to be a couple of weeks ago by the time this publishes that I was talking to Dan Bassey. And one of his slides that he had at the presentation we were both, or at the conference we were both speaking at, was he was showing how, at least in the United States, more people are eating out than are eating in, which is not normal. But when you actually look at where they're eating, it's not like they're going to fine dining in places like that. It's actually because you've seen such higher costs with food, they're going to fast food. And he talked about how look at your local fast food restaurants from around 4 to 7 p.m. every day. There's lines out the corner. And I mean, I'm in the Southeast, so maybe it's a bad sort of thing to compare, but he's right. When I drive by the Chick-fil-A that's a couple blocks away, like don't drive by it between 4 and 7 p.m. because people do want those cheaper prices. There's something to be said for, you talked about, big is better. We want more amalgamation. There's something to be said for vertical integration, because if you can move up the value chain, I was joking with this, I talked to some pulse growers in North Dakota earlier this year in January in Minot, which was very cold, in case you were wondering, listeners. But I love hummus. I make my own hummus because I can't get hummus in the United States that reminds me of anything resembling like what it actually tastes like in the Middle East. And I joked to that audience, like, if you're growing chickpeas, like, look, like people are consuming more and more chickpeas in the United States because they need more cheap protein. Hummus is a good thing to give babies and kids because you can like mash. So you don't have to go buy expensive baby food. Just mash up some chickpeas and also make some hummus for the adults, things like that. But if your farm is growing chickpeas, you should probably make your own hummus. And if you could brand it and have a loyal following and get people on a subscription model, maybe there's something there. But that's maybe a little bit too pie in the sky.
But again, you brought up fast food restaurants, and like, I mean, I'm a Canadian, but I'm sort of like, I'm a big admirer in the ingenuity and creativity of what America's done, right? And the U.S. entrepreneurial thing. And you think about, sometimes you'll see a commercial or an advertisement and you'll say like, Burger King, McDonald's, whatever. And it's like, $7.99, you get this, this, and this, or even Warren Buffett's company, like Dairy Queen. Like it seems like an amazing deal. But, like another one of Warren Buffett's favorite companies is Coca-Cola. And you think about like this intrinsic partnership that and of course a lot of the soft drinks in the US are made with corn syrup like as the sweetener, and you think of the intrinsic partnership between McDonald's and Coke and the various soft drink companies, and basically like the soft drink is an amazing profit margin for them, right? And Coke and Pepsi, the two big ones, they know like, it's great advertising for them, because people associate, having a Coke is like nice to go down with your burger, whatever. And yet, I mean, like every facet of that sort of happy meal or whatever they're doing is sort of priced out so that, it gets, they make money from it. Right. And I mean, you can't argue with it. And it's right down to the core level of what we're doing in the Corn Belt, right? We're growing all this corn, we're fractionating it, we're giving them this cheap source of a sweetener. There's some protections on the sugar industry and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just saying, like, as a consumer, I mean, I want to be a good dad. I don't want to buy too much of that for my kids, but sometimes I say I can go to the grocery store and buy, vegetable number one, vegetable number two, a protein. And, to feed, I have a family of five. To feed a family of five, I'm probably up to like, $30 right there, versus like pull through the drive-through, somebody hands it to me. Kids are like, it's like the crack cocaine for kids. You give them some of that Coke or that Pepsi or whatever, and then the fries and stuff. So
well,
it's a good model.
It literally used to be the crack cocaine for kids. But
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say about this, because I think this is an interesting tangent before we leave to some of the other stuff. I mean, but Coke and Pepsi, if you look at what they're doing, they're also changing things up a little bit. They're selling smaller cans now in the store. I think they're worried about government and health issues going after them. So if you can reduce the actual sugar in the thing, you also probably get better margins if inflation, if their inputs are going up, if they can sell, for a similar price, but it's a smaller can. But they're selling smaller and smaller cans when you go to the store. And the other interesting thing that they're doing is, I mean, Coke it was always Coke, right? Like they didn't want to blend their stuff with other products. But I saw a billboard as I was in the rental car home from Madison earlier this week, and it was Jack and Coke in a can. So it's Coca-Cola and Jack Daniels are putting their drink into a can together. Think about Coke's acquisition of Topo Chico. I drink way too much Topo Chico in this house long before Coke bought it, but they're hard seltzer things. So like even Coke is starting to say, I don't know, like the thing that you're talking about, maybe that doesn't have a future. Maybe we need to get into water, or maybe we need to get into alcohol. Like I think there's changes afoot even there, and farmers should look at what those front end producers are doing and say, some of that's interesting. I wonder what changes they're seeing. I wonder how that affects me. Um, but
For sure, for sure.
let's talk about what we're supposed to be experts about, which is I want to go to the thing you said about geopolitics, because I think there's two big issues here. And let's start with the war premium from Russia, Ukraine. Um, I feel like farmers should know that like commodity prices are volatile. So just because we've been in a lull lately because we were at historically high prices doesn't mean that that's the way it's going to go forward. Look at this Black Sea grain initiative. So, earlier this month, Russia came out and said, okay, we're going to approve a 60-day extension of the Black Sea grain initiative, which was supposed to expire tomorrow. We're recording March 17th, so this might be a little bit dated by that time, but it was supposed to expire tomorrow. The Ukrainians rightly point out, hey, the initial deal says if nobody has objections, it automatically renews at 120 days. So what's going to happen on March 18th? Is it going to renew automatically for 120 days? Do the Russians know that by putting in the 60-day thing that they're going to scuttle the deal and then there won't be a deal because they'll say, oh, we didn't get agreement, so it's kind of gone? There's also, what's going on with the war. I really don't like that Ukraine is basically, I don't want to say, what's the right way to say this? I mean, Ukraine is committing a lot of resources to defending Bakhmut. It's not super strategic. It's not super important. It seems to me that if you're just being sort of very cold about it, you should pull back to a more defensible position and pick off Russian attacks, not try and hold this city that really isn't that important in the grand strategic scheme of things against a Russian onslaught. There are better ways to inflict more casualties on Russia going forward. All of which is to say, the war is not over unless Xi Jinping is going to pull a peace deal out of his magic bag of tricks when he goes to Moscow soon. Like, I don't see the war ending anytime soon. And also to your point, we're only going to see the reflection of the war premium in future years. Like, Ukraine had plenty of fertilizer stored up before. It's not going to have that going forward in 23, 24, 25 if the war continues. And no geopolitical risk analyst worth their salt is going to tell you for sure one way or another whether it's going to go, because we don't know. We have no idea. It could end tomorrow. I could give you a scenario where it ends next week. I could give you a scenario where it goes on for another 5 years. So I don't know. I understand the war premium thing, but that seems to me to be more about, okay, well, you need to play long and short and understand where we are in the cycle and things like that. But the war premium might come back. I wouldn't sort of write that off.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think, like one thing I broadly disagree with, but, again, like, it, I can want something, but, or I can see something that I think is right. But if the market tells me that, they're going to view it a different way, it's hard to fight the market, right? Like I always say, the price is the price. Like, as much as you say, sometimes farmers talk about, oh, we deserve this, like that's the cost of break even. I say, well, that doesn't really matter. It's market doesn't care about you individually. The market's job is to find the high cost producer and, annihilate them with prejudice, right? So with extreme prejudice. And I mean, that's just the way it is. But, the grain quarter has always sort of like baffled me because, there was a brief period of time where the grain quarter was sort of like not in force. And, grain kept coming out. They didn't need to get inspected in the Bosphorus at that time. And I think, the Russians sort of panicked and said, well, look, like we're going to lose a bit of control here. We better get this one back. Like, that's how I read it. But yet, now it comes to another point in time where the corridor might be, extended, not extended, whatever. And it, like, most of my European colleagues, they all think it's important. The market seems to thinks it's important. I mean, I don't see, I'm not a war expert. I don't know anything about war. I hope, and I'm glad about that. But, like, I don't know about Bakhmut, like you said, maybe. But the one thing I would say is that, like, Russia had some objectives. The objectives was regime change in Ukraine. The way they thought that would happen was take Kiev. They couldn't take Kiev. Now they've maybe adjusted their things, but clearly they're not doing a good job of winning the war, so to speak. And how would you win the war? Well, you got to raise the cost of Ukraine fighting the war, right? And to me, one of those ways would be like, really shutting down their ability to get stuff or get stuff out, right? And, as much as we talk about it, like, you know, like again, like I'm not an advisor for Putin, but I would have said, like, do you guys not have an air force? Do you not have, like, you know, don't bomb everywhere, just bomb critical points, like, bomb the port in Odessa over and over and over again, prevent them from doing exports. I mean, like in the past, that's been a successful way to wage war, is to try to get the pressure points and to, limit that. And my comment here is not to tell them to do that. My comment is clearly people have told them to do that. They can't do it. They don't have, for all their bells and whistles, they don't have a modern military like the United States. They waged a war like it was going to be, we're going to drive in there and, do it. I mean, like, love or hate the United States, but when they're not maybe good at occupation, but they're pretty darn good at like executing an actual, like, let's cut the head off the tiger and take what we need. And the first part of that is overwhelming air superiority and a lot of like destroying critical apparatus. And so basically this is a long way to say that, like, we're in this grind of a war. People have determined that the export corridor is important. So I'll have to agree that it's important. I don't think it's important. I think Ukraine could export without it and probably more successfully. But it is important. So, like, I guess they want to extend it 60 days. Some people have said it's tied to the fact that there's 60 days from now is roughly like something like May 18th, and the Turkish election is May 14th, and Erdogan is, Turkey's sort of a signatory to that export corridor. They're sort of enforcing or allowing the Russians to do the inspections close to the Bosphorus. So, maybe that's tied there. If Erdogan loses, I think Russia loses a bit of leverage on this, because, the next guy's probably part of the way they're going to distinguish themselves from Erdogan is maybe not be as pro-Russia. I don't know. I think Erdogan's trying to play it both ways. He's got his own concerns. You know those way better than I do.
I want to jump in there and say, well, first of all, you said that line about farmers saying what they deserve. Have you seen the movie Unforgiven?
Yes. With Clint Eastwood?
Yeah, with Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman right at the end. And listeners, if here's a spoiler. So if you haven't seen this movie, please pause the podcast and go watch this movie. But right at the end there, where Clint Eastwood finally gets drunk after he's been fighting it the whole time, and he shoots Gene Hackman. And Gene Hackman's on the floor. He's like, "I don't deserve this," and Clint Eastwood does the "deserves got nothing to do with it," and then offs him. I don't know. I had that scene come into my mind when you said that. So if farmers are thinking they deserve prices, go watch Unforgiven, and you'll understand exactly what you deserve.
It's like the old line, like where you're at the poker table and you can't figure out who the dupe is. Well, it's probably you, right? And I think, like, farmers, like, I mean, they know this and they don't know it. And it's sort of like farmers always have a very local perspective. Like, what is my price? What's going on here? How much is the basis here, right? And, a lot of farmers are intrigued by the bigger picture, but it's time consuming to find out what's happening everywhere. But the one thing I can say unequivocally is there's cause and effect. And if prices go up, you see an incentive. So does the guy sitting in Ethiopia growing wheat. So does the guy sitting in Australia growing wheat. Like, high prices are the cure for high prices, because people all over the world are good at doing their job. And, like, there's no such thing as somebody who's tended the land for a long time, who's like, an inefficient or bad farmer. There might be different techniques, but, and of course, when the prices go up, everybody's now got a bit more incentive to modernize, to like buy the newer tractor, to buy whatever it is that possibly can produce. And the one thing farmers know, I said this earlier in the podcast and I'll say it again, is the one thing you can't take from farmers is yield. And, I've been in China and I've seen how farmers farm in China many times. And I was in the Central Chinese Plain one time, and, along comes the custom combiner, right? This is like 2013. This isn't like, 1975 or something like this. It's 2013. And I'm pretty sure the behaviors, if not the same, it might be even more intensified. So the The custom combiner, he combines that farmer's field. Relatively small field. We're talking maybe an acre, 2 acres. That's what the farmer has, maybe even less than that. The farmer and his family are right there. As soon as the wheat comes off, one guy takes a bunch of it in a bag, drives into the local flour miller, and mills that flour. This isn't their commercial flour. Now, this is their own personal flour. Mm-hmm. And most of the Chinese houses out in the rural areas, when you go into them, they have a bag of flour, like a storage space for their annual supply of flour right there. And it's a sort of like, maybe 30% goes to him, 70% goes to the market. Like, and again, like the 30% is a food security, but the 70% is cash income. So they want to maximize their cash income. And the Chinese in general, when I first started in the business a long time ago, the Chinese did not have a world-class wheat yield. And they put a tremendous amount of effort into it. And now they have a world-class wheat yield. Like it's comparable to what you would get on good farmland in most other places. And they still don't have a world-class corn yield. So that's their next step. And you can hear, this is the time of year when if you watch the messaging out of China, it's always like, we're going to be more self-sufficient. We're going to grow more soybeans. We're going to get better yields. We're going to do better practices. And, they're working on it. I mean, they're trying to get better yields because, again, my big point is just that yield is very important to the farmer. That is the one thing they feel they control outside of course, the weather aspects to it, but they want to produce more.
Yeah. We'll get back to China in a second, although, I mean, the nice thing, well, not the nice thing, the thing that China has going for it with corn, of course, is that Brazil is gangbusters and China's approved imports of GMO corn from Brazil. And I think corn farmers in the United States and Canada, everywhere else, are about to experience what soybean farmers have already experienced when you have Brazil, which is as a competitor. But before we jump on that topic, I don't want to leave the war premium conversation quite yet. I just want to say one more thing, because you talked about how Russia needs to raise the cost of the war for Ukraine. And I just want to do a slight tweak to that, because it's not about raising the cost of war for Ukraine. I think Ukraine has shown you they'll pay just about any cost. At least that's the way that Zelensky is governing. What Russia has to do is raise the cost for the countries that are supporting Ukraine, and most importantly, that are arming Ukraine. And this is where I go back to the war premium issue, because Russian oil, Russian natural gas, those levers didn't work. The one place where Russia's levers seem to work a little bit is with grains. They seem to be able to move the market when it comes to wheat and corn and fertilizer and things like that. It's the only tool in their toolkit that actually seems to work against the West and gets the West angry, because the West can find more oil, it can find more LNG, it can find more coal, it can find more energy. But when you start to get into the food system, Ukraine and Russia together play too much of a big role. So if you see Russia trying to raise the cost of food for countries that are going to arm Ukraine, and without those foreign countries, Ukraine can't fight. They just can't make the weapons themselves. Then you start to see, oh, is that where the war premium comes back in? And again, we're recording here March 17th. Yesterday, Poland came out and said, we're going to give fighter jets to Russia. Does that sound like a conflict that is anywhere close to ending? Poland is maybe the country that has the most invested in Ukraine beating back the Russians all the way to the border. They've been pushing everyone in the West to go with fighter jets. It hasn't happened yet. Is Poland trying to lead the way there? Tanks were off the table at one point for the West. Then they were on the table. Fighter jets, according to the Biden White House and Macron and everyone else, not right now. Is Poland trying to put them back on the table? So those are all things to keep in mind. And then the last point you made about Russia not having a modern military, absolutely. And you said it exactly right. This war it's about grind. It's a grind. It's a daily grind, grinding it out. That's what Russia has more than anybody else. They will outdie and out-endure and out-suffer everyone. That's how they've won every single war they've fought over the past 4 or 5 centuries. They will take more punishment, and they will still be there fighting, and they'll let the winter do its work when you're actually trying to get to their heartland. So for all of that, that's a lot of the dynamics that are going on there, and why I would watch the war premium. Because if Russia is using grain as a leverage, maybe the war premium comes back. If Russia is exhausted, if this is not our father's Russia or our grandfather's Russia or the Russia that we've known for 400 years, and they really are going to get tired, then maybe there is no war premium and we could see a collapse. So those are just some of the issues I want to put on the table there.
I think that there will be a war premium, and I see it coming in 23, 24, because we like to watch what the big 8 exporters have for exportable surplus. Big 8 are US, Canada, Argentina, the EU, Australia, Kazakhstan. They're a little bit of a lesser one now because they've they had a difficulty exporting raw wheat because, it had to go through Russia, a lot of it. So they got into the flour milling business in a big way, value added. And, now they supply a lot of the Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, all the stands, and, a little bit into China too, and then Russia and Ukraine. And, if you look at the, ending stocks in those 8, they've been sort of in a steady decline for the last 7 years. And next year, one thing that we probably are pretty certain on, like Russia is going to have a smaller crop year on year. Now, there's a lot of debate about the size of their crop in 22, 23. Some people say, 104, 105 million, but some people say, well, that includes 10 million tons of wheat stolen from Ukraine. So they really only produce 95. Like, I think the USDA is only at 93. And they're quite insistent that it was a smaller crop than what Russia did based on their long-term success. And they have been the most successful, thing. I tend to think that it was a bigger crop. I don't really care what the size of the crop was anymore because my focus now is on 23, 24. And I think it's going to be a smaller crop. Now, the Russian analysts themselves are saying something like 85, 86, 87. That's like a 17 million ton decline from 104. Ukraine didn't plant as much wheat. They haven't been able to service as much wheat. So, the net from those two is probably going to be like a reduction in an exportable surplus of, somewhere between 10 and 20 million tons. Now you have to make it up. Well, the EU might have a bit more wheat. My colleagues in the EU are extremely bearish. My only comment on that would be that they're in the EU. The EU is like, if you wanted to like read a book about, like complicated non-market decision-making in agriculture, like the EU would probably have like a Collier's encyclopedia, like, 28. They'd have to invent a few new letters to contain the books. And you just see like it's such a sensitive hot button topic that a party in the Netherlands came out of nowhere and won like, the Senate in the Netherlands on these farming issues because, they're in this constant battle between like production and, environmental like signaling to the population to vote a certain way. So I don't know what the EU is going to do, but let's say they have some extra. Australia, they have a long tail because they had a gigantic crop, all-time record just produced. Argentina, a very small crop. They won't have much of a tail. But Australia, the weather system's probably going into an El Nino, at least not a La Nina. So, last time they had a big El Nino, they produced 15 million tons of wheat. I'm not saying that's what they're going to do in 23, 24, but, I wouldn't pencil in 38, 37. I pencil in, I think A-Bears themselves penciled in 28. So that won't be an immediate impact in the first part of the 23, 24 marketing year because they produce a little later in but their tail, at the end of 23, 24 and into 24, 25 won't be as long because it just simply can't be with that production. So that leaves 2 countries, Canada and the US. You have to now extract more wheat out of those countries. Yeah, there'll be a bit of exotic wheat that comes out, but it's probably not going to come out of India because, they don't have the supply. China's not an exporter, even though they're the biggest wheat producer in the world. So, it's not going to come out of there. So you get a bit of South African, you get a bit of, maybe like Turkey's not got good weather. So you're not going to get much out of Turkey. You can get some out of a few other places, but it's not, it's not going to be something that, solves the problem. So basically you're back to Canada and the US. The Canadian farmer, he is planting more wheat. And I think he's making a good decision in that part. And we have extra export capacity. So we will be able to export more. But Canadian is also like, there's lots of costs. You got to get it from the center of Canada out to where the boats are. So, we tend to be like a higher, we want a little bit of a premium to get our wheat out because it costs more, right? And we consider it to be the best wheat in the world or, amongst the best wheat in the world because it's spring wheat. It's got protein. It's really good for lots of baking. It makes wonderful pizza and people love pizza. And then the US. And there is no circumstance where you pull more wheat out of the US and prices don't go higher because wheat is always going to be in third place in terms of gaining export capacity in the US behind beans, behind corn. There's the variable storage rate, which incentivizes people to just, companies to just hold wheat and gather money that way. That's maybe a little less attractive in sort of a higher interest rate environment than it was in a lower interest rate environment. But, if you want to materially get an extra, say, 4 or 5 million tons of wheat out of the U.S., I mean, and just like penciling it out, that might be what is wanted. They're never going to get 4 or 5 million more tons year on year out of the U.S. But to me, that says that because the exportable surplus in all these countries collectively is tighter, and the two countries that are going to have relatively more exportable surplus other than the EU are Canada and the US, like that's the North American situation. And I mean, that's like right back to, leading up to 2007, 8, 2012, those types of things where you see these sort of like price spikes because the world has to come to North America. And I think that's the war premium, because left to their own devices, Ukraine would have seen sort of like a market signal that, more wheat is wanted and would have planted a bit more wheat, and yeah, so I'm a little bit optimistic 23, 24. I mean, again, it's like the one thing I'd say is that, maybe it's a case of being the tallest kid in kindergarten. Like if the U.S. corn crop hits 181.5 yield, that's sort of what the USDA outlook said, the whole grains and oilseeds complex is going to ratchet down. So wheat might be the winner, but it's in relative terms, it's actually lower than this year where it was the loser.
Right. That's a terrific point, and I haven't heard that anywhere else. So, yeah, I need to think on that for a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the dragon in the room, which is China, before we close the podcast. And of course, folks, like come listen to the event we're doing at GrainFox if you want to hear more along these lines. We're really just scratching the surface with some of these topics. But I've been a little more optimistic on China lately, and I wonder how you feel about that, because there's a couple different things happening with China. It seems to me, first of all, that the reopening is real. They've gotten through the worst case scenario with COVID didn't happen. The worst case scenario with the real estate crisis so far has not happened. There is the tech trade war, and that's going to affect Chinese growth, I think, at the top line. But the tech trade war is not going to affect the diet of 1.2 billion Chinese people. They still need to eat, and the United States is not talking about putting on export restrictions on agricultural commodities. If anything, the United States is doing this thing with China where it's like, all right, we're going to cripple you technologically, but we also want you to buy more of our agricultural commodities. And I keep telling farmers, like, this is eventually going to come to a head. I don't think it's going to come to a head in 23, 24, though, because China, they're brokering deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're talking to Putin and to Zelensky. They've demoted the wolf warrior diplomats. Xi is talking about global civilization and diversity and how we all need to be nice to each other and things like that. I think that's China telegraphing to you, hey, we're weak. We need to import lots of these things. We want to, max out our storage of all the things that we need because the future does not look very good. And our economy is humming at 2019 levels. 2021 and 22 are all terrible years from the Chinese economy from a consumption point of view. So you put all those things together, I think, especially for the farmer, even though I often warn about access to the Chinese market on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, this might be a good year unless you're in a crop like corn where Brazil is just going to outcompete you. But in general, this might be a good year, and this might also be the type of year where you can use some of the gains to maybe think about what your position is with China long term and start looking at an India or an Ethiopia or some of these other places around the world. So I wanted to ask you, in Australians who are exporting coal suddenly find that China is willing to import it after years of not wanting to import it, and because they had all these diplomatic problems with Australia. Is Canada or Canadian farmers feeling any of that? Are you getting more interest from China? Are exports to China maybe going to go up? Are you optimistic about China as a market in 23, 24? Or do you think that this tech trade war is just going to bleed into everything and that it's all fool's gold?
No, I'm, do I know exactly what's going on in China? No. Do the Chinese know exactly what's going on in China? No. It's a huge country. I think, the Chinese government controls lots of things, but they maybe don't control, like, I told that anecdote about being out there in the, in the countryside and seeing the farmer behavior, right? The other one I would say would be when I'm in Northeast China where they produce a lot of the corn. I always say this to a group of farmers in Canada or the US when I'm speaking to them. I said, like, if I brought in one Chinese farmer from the Northeast so that now the room was half Chinese farmers and half American or Canadian farmers, I would have raised the average age of the farmers in the room by 10 years. Like, these are old people farming, right? I think that, there's a lot of structural things that the Chinese have going on. And we've talked a lot in the past about, the demographics aren't in their favor. And long term, it won't be as much demand because there'll be a lot fewer Chinese. But there's also the structural problem of getting to that place. And that structural problem is probably more sensitive in the agricultural sector than anywhere else, because those tend to be the oldest people who aren't, or it's a part-time thing or something like that. I am very optimistic, like all of the writ large things you said about China. I think that, I just think their observation of the world from a leadership standpoint, and, she would be of this generation. Most of the American leaders of competence are still of this generation. A lot of the, European leaders are of this generation. Like, they see an interest in maintaining bilateral, multilateral trade. That's how countries have got to where they are today, and sure, there's some things that are going to be like, some technology that's very secret. You need to maintain that, but nobody really cares about it's just window dressing to say, like, I'm wearing a shirt that was made in America versus a shirt that was made in Bangladesh or China or wherever, right? It's mutually beneficial to trade. And I think that one thing that China's probably found out, and we should be finding it out as well, and we know it, we just try to ignore it, is that we need them, they need us. We need them for lots of stuff because, I like cheap stuff. I might need a new TV because I was worried my TV was broken. That TV might have been built in China, somewhere over there. I don't know. It certainly wasn't built in Winnipeg, Canada. And they need our food. And I'd say, like, on the margins, we started to see them buy more. And they bought a big amount of sorghum after not buying any for a long time. They made 3 big purchases of corn this week, daily sales. They bought more that hasn't been reported. They've been buying barley from Canada, even though everybody's been saying, like, doom and gloom, it's over, it's over, it's over, it's over. I think they need it. I don't think we have a good grasp on what their stocks are. I don't think they have a good grasp on what their stocks are because, presumably, they would prefer if the farmer put 100% of his wheat into commercial channels and not held back 20 or 30%. They would prefer their rice farmers to put 100% of their rice into commercial channels, not hold back, because it, like the ASF, like the Asian swine flu, like they would prefer all of the pigs to live in 18-story buildings and not in the backyard of all the farmers in the rural areas, because that's their walking food security. It's also an indication that food and governments and all of those things are still very sensitive in China because, people deem that it's worthwhile for them as a practice of being a citizen of China to take care of their own food security first before they put everything into commercial channels and just rebuy it. I mean, most of us in Canada, like most farmers, they don't bake bread out of the wheat they grow. They just go to the grocery store and buy a loaf of bread. Whereas, the Chinese are saying that, still to this day, 2023, they still want to say, like, I need a pork chop. I got my pig in the back. Now, the backyard pig has been eradicated quite a bit from the ASF. There's, conspiracy theories would say that one reason why the ASF was as big as it was because the Chinese government wanted to eradicate the backyard pig. But, they still exist. I mean, people have them. So that being said, I mean, I'm very optimistic that China will be a participant in the global agricultural trade. And I think that for the next, probably 1 to 10 years, we'll still see an upward slope for that. And then the rate of that slope's going to decline. And then probably we'll go into a period where it's pretty status quo for a while. And then it will decline just because, they're going to go from 1.2, 1.3 billion down to like, 7 or 800 million or whatever it is. I'll be long gone when they get to there, but, at least from the industry, hopefully still walking around in the world. But And the other thing too, just final point I'll make on China is that, like, these are smart people. And I mean, if they look at the world, and certainly they can exploit things because of the Russian-Ukraine war, they can kind of, edge in where sort of like the U.S. is maybe not being, competent or capable to kind of, make a few sort of like, they got the embassies reopened between Saudi and that, and they can use some of this to kind of increase their, but I think more than anything, they look at this and just say, like, they do not want to go down the pathway of Russia. Like, they don't want to be a pariah state, an enemy state. It doesn't work for them. And I think that, it'd be interesting to see if in the back rooms in China, if they're wondering, like, boy, like, if we did a bunch of things that were basically a bit of a debacle, like, would our people stay with us to the same extent that the Russians are staying with their government? And I honestly think the answer is no, they wouldn't. And that's the thing, like, public opinion in China, like on the Weibo and all those things, like, again, not an expert in this, but it's extremely powerful and extremely sort of like, it can flip on a dime. Like, we're pro that, oh, now we're anti that. You know what I mean? And with again, they're not out in the streets protesting, but I think that the Chinese government, they have to pay attention to that more than Putin does in a certain extent, to see what's happening in the sort of, realms of internet thought.
Absolutely. I mean, I forget which dynasty it is, so I won't pretend to. I think, is it the Tang dynasty or the Shang? Heaven is high and the emperor is far away. Like, even when we're in strong periods of Chinese political consolidation, it's very hard. And you can see that from China hasn't been able to get its old people to take COVID-19 vaccines. To your point about African swine fever, they're having another outbreak. If you had managed to get rid of all the backyard pigs, you probably wouldn't be having another outbreak, but old habits die hard. And the other thing there is, there are people whose living memory remember Chairman Mao and what he did with agriculture in the 1950s. And if you had put everything into the Chinese, all for export or all to the central government, you would have been one of the millions of people who died because of Mao's ridiculous thing about rural collectivization and things like that. So I take your point there in general. Neil, I could talk to you all day, but it's been 50 minutes. I think let's tease out and tell the listeners, if you want to hear more about Canadian perspective, you want to hear more about India, you want to hear more bad jokes from me, they're just overflowing right now. So sign up for April 12th. And otherwise, Neil, this was a great podcast, and we'll have you back on soon, okay?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacob. You do a great job. I love your podcast. I recommend people listen to it. I just wish it happened at a greater frequency because, I've listened to them all, but, now let's go in. And the last point I'll make is, like, I think people who maybe think, I'm curious about this agriculture stuff, they might enjoy the April 12th session because, we talk about it in sort of a broad sense and a narrow sense. And I think it's informative. And I also think it will be entertaining. So please join us on April 12th if you have the time and inclination.
Yeah, and we can put out more content if more of you listen. So if somebody could get a line to the 1.2 billion Chinese and tell them all to download this podcast immediately, we'll put out podcasts every 10 minutes if you want. We'll give the people what they want. So cheers, Neil. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.